This is HOA checkmate. The tow receipt was my first clue and her last mistake. Sharon shoved a tow yard rate sheet toward my face and yelled that she loved the storage fees. "You just earned yourself a fee," she said, jabbing her finger at the paper like she was landing a punch. I stepped back and felt the wind slam my car door shut behind me. The sudden gust made the rate sheet flutter in her hand, but she held it steady, smiling like she had just won something. I work nights managing a car rental lot in Boca Raton, and I cannot afford to miss shifts because my vehicle got immobilized or towed over some made-up violation. My elderly parent is staying with me right now, and the stress from all this HOA nonsense is making everything harder. Sharon King is the Gate Access Administrator for the Autumn Ridge Parking Compliance Association, and she has been abusing access codes and tow authorizations for weeks. Today, my friend parked in my driveway to drop off groceries, and Sharon started a timer on her phone like a traffic cop, standing at the curb with a clipboard and a clear plastic sleeve. The rate sheet listed daily storage fees, impound release charges, and administrative surcharges that added up faster than I could process. Sharon tapped the bottom line with her pen. "That is $240 if you want your car back tomorrow," she said. "And if you wait longer, well, you know how it goes." I asked what violation she was even citing, and she flipped the clipboard around to show me a handwritten citation form with my plate number and a timestamp from 11 minutes ago. "Guest pass expired," she said. "No appeal." I told her my friend was dropping off groceries and leaving in 5 minutes. Sharon shook her head and said the rules are clear. Guest parking requires a valid decal and advanced registration through the gate system. She pointed at my friend's car, still in my driveway with the trunk open. "Your driveway is private property, but your guests used the community gate without proper authorization," she said. "That makes the vehicle subject to compliance action." My friend walked over holding 2 grocery bags and asked what was happening. Sharon turned and told him he needed to move his car immediately, or she would call the tow vendor. He said he was parked in my driveway, not on the street. Sharon said it did not matter because he entered through a controlled gate without a registered guest pass. She pulled a roll of bright warning stickers from her blazer pocket and started peeling one off dramatically. "I am giving you 2 minutes," she said. "Then I make the call." I grabbed my phone and opened the camera app, but Sharon did not flinch. "Your camera does not matter. My minutes are the truth," she said, holding up her phone timer. She tapped the screen to show me the countdown, 1 minute 40 seconds. My friend looked at me, confused, and I told him to just go. He loaded the last bag into his car and backed out of the driveway while Sharon stood there with the sticker in her hand, watching him leave. As soon as he turned the corner, she peeled the sticker off and stuck it on my mailbox instead. "That is your warning," she said. "Next time, it is a tow." Then she handed me the rate sheet, folded it once, and walked back toward the gatehouse with her clipboard tucked under her arm. I stood there holding the paper, reading the fees over and over, trying to figure out how this was legal. That night, I called a local attorney I know through family, a guy named Rick who handles HOA disputes. I explained the guest pass scam and the tow threats, and he listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said Sharon was running a classic compliance shakedown. The tow vendor gets a cut of the fees, the HOA gets a cut of the fines, and Sharon probably gets a performance bonus tied to citation volume. He said the first thing I needed to do was request copies of the parking rules, the tow authorization policy, and the vendor contract. If Sharon refuses or delays, that is evidence, he said. If she provides them, check the fine print for procedural gaps. I sent an email to the HOA management company that night requesting all parking-related documents, citing Florida statute on homeowner access to records. I got an automated reply saying requests are processed within 10 business days. Rick told me to document every interaction with Sharon from now on. Timestamps, photos, witnesses, everything. He said the key was proving either that the rules were being applied selectively or that the authorization process was not being followed. If Sharon is issuing tow orders without proper board approval, that is a liability problem for the HOA, he said. And if the tow vendor is cooperating without verifying authorization, they are exposed too. The next morning, I was getting ready for my shift when I heard a diesel engine idling in front of my house. I looked out the window and saw a flatbed tow truck backed up to the curb, amber lights flashing. Sharon was standing next to the driver, pointing at my car in the driveway. I ran outside in my work shirt and asked what was going on. The driver, a guy in a stained hoodie with a wheel lift remote in his hand, said he had an authorization to impound a vehicle for an expired guest pass. I told him I lived here, and my car was registered. Sharon stepped between us and said the authorization was for a repeat offender vehicle that posed a safety hazard. She held up a handheld plate scanner and thrust it inches from my rear plate, keeping the screen turned away from me. I asked the driver if he verified the authorization with the HOA board or the management company. He looked at Sharon, then back at me, and said he works off the compliance officer's orders. I told him Sharon is not a compliance officer. She is a gate administrator, and she does not have the authority to issue tow orders without board approval. Sharon cut in and said she absolutely does, and she pulled a laminated card from her pocket that said Parking Enforcement Authority. I asked her when the board voted to give her that power, and she said it was approved at the annual meeting last year. I told her I wanted to see the meeting minutes. Sharon laughed and said I could request them through the management company like everyone else. Then she turned to the tow driver and told him to proceed. The driver lowered the wheel lift arm and started positioning it under my rear axle. I stepped in front of my car and said I was not moving until I saw written authorization from the board. Sharon pulled out her phone and said, "I am calling management, and I am going to be dramatic about it." She held the phone up to her ear and started talking to someone, pacing back and forth on the sidewalk. The driver stopped and pulled the lift arm back up. He told me he was not getting in the middle of this, and if there was a dispute about authorization, he needed it resolved before he touched the vehicle. Sharon turned and told him she was the authority, and that was all the authorization he needed. The driver shook his head and said his company policy requires a signed tow slip from either a board member or the management company. Sharon's face went red. She told him he was violating his contract with the HOA, and she would have him replaced by the end of the week. The driver climbed back into his truck and said he would wait for the paperwork. Sharon screamed at him that she had the paperwork, but he just sat there with the engine idling. She turned to me and said this was not over, then walked back toward the gatehouse, still yelling into her phone. The driver gave me a tired look and said this happens all the time with this HOA. He said 3 other residents had complained about Sharon this week alone, and his boss was already asking questions about the authorization process. He told me if I had proof Sharon was issuing bogus orders, his company would back off completely. I went inside and grabbed my phone, then sent Rick a text summarizing what just happened. He replied within minutes and said the tow vendor's refusal was a good sign. It meant Sharon did not have the authority she claimed, and the vendor knew it. He told me to keep pressing for the meeting minutes and the vendor contract, and to start talking to neighbors about their experiences. If we can show a pattern of abuse, we can force a special meeting and put Sharon on the record, he said. I started knocking on doors that afternoon. The first neighbor I talked to, a woman named Linda who lived 2 houses down, said Sharon had threatened to tow her son's car 3 times in the past month. He was home from college and parked in her driveway, but Sharon said he needed a temporary resident decal that cost $75 and took 2 weeks to process. Linda said she paid the fee just to avoid the hassle, but her son left before the decal even arrived. Another neighbor, a guy named Greg who lived across the street, said Sharon had cited him for parking in a fire lane when he was unloading furniture in front of his own house. He said the fire lane designation was not marked on the curb, and when he asked Sharon for proof, she told him ignorance of the rules was not an excuse. By the end of the day, I had talked to 8 neighbors, and 6 of them had stories about Sharon threatening tows, demanding fees for guest passes that did not exist, or blocking access to the gatehouse records. One neighbor showed me a stack of citations Sharon had left on his windshield over the past 2 months, all for violations he said he never committed. The citations had no appeal process listed, just a payment deadline and a warning that failure to pay would result in a lien against the property. I took photos of every citation, every email, every text message the neighbors were willing to share. Rick told me to compile everything into a timeline and send it to the management company with a formal complaint. He said if the management company ignored it, we could escalate to the state regulatory board that oversees HOAs. But he also warned me that Sharon would probably retaliate once she found out I was organizing neighbors. She is going to see this as a threat to her control, he said. Expect her to double down. If you are enjoying this story, hit like and subscribe for more wild HOA drama where the bad guys actually lose. He was right. 2 days later, I got a certified letter from the HOA management company informing me that my vehicle registration was under review due to multiple compliance violations. The letter said I had 14 days to provide proof of insurance, vehicle ownership, and current residency, or my access privileges would be suspended and my vehicle would be subject to removal from the community. The letter was signed by Sharon King, acting as interim parking compliance director. I called Rick and read him the letter over the phone. He said the interim title was a red flag. If Sharon had promoted herself without a board vote, that was a procedural violation. He told me to respond in writing, copying the entire board and the management company, and to demand a copy of the board resolution appointing Sharon to the compliance director role. Also request the meeting minutes from the vote, he said. If there was no vote, Sharon is acting outside her authority, and everything she has done since then is invalid. I drafted the response that night and sent it via email and certified mail. I included a list of every citation Sharon had issued in the past 3 months, cross-referenced with neighbor testimonies and photos. I asked for copies of the parking rules, the tow vendor contract, the meeting minutes authorizing Sharon's new role, and the legal basis for the lien threats. I ended the letter by stating that I was on call for work and I cannot have my vehicle immobilized or towed, and that any attempt to do so without proper authorization would be met with legal action. The next morning, I got a call from a property manager at the HOA management company, a woman named Denise, who spoke in a forced, cheerful tone. She said she was calling to discuss my concerns and to clarify the parking rules. I told her I wanted everything in writing, and I wanted to know when the board voted to appoint Sharon as compliance director. Denise paused, then said she would have to check the records and get back to me. I asked when, and she said within a few days. I told her I needed it before the 14-day deadline in the letter, or I would assume the appointment was invalid and the letter was void. Denise's tone changed. She said the board had delegated enforcement authority to Sharon as part of a broader compliance initiative, and that the details would be provided in due course. I asked if there were meeting minutes documenting the vote, and she said she could not discuss board matters over the phone. I told her that Florida law requires HOAs to provide meeting minutes within 10 business days of a request, and I had already requested them a week ago. She said she would follow up with the board and hung up. That afternoon, Sharon showed up at my door with 2 men I had never seen before. One was holding a phone, filming. The other was wearing a vest that said Community Safety Patrol, but it looked homemade. Sharon stood on my front step and said she was conducting a welfare check because multiple residents had reported unusual activity at my property. I asked what activity, and she said she was not at liberty to discuss it. I told her to leave, and she said she had a right to inspect common areas for safety violations. I pointed out that my front porch was not a common area, and she said the HOA bylaws gave her access to any property for enforcement purposes. I pulled out my phone and started recording. Sharon stepped back and told the guy with the vest to note the hostile behavior. I told her she was trespassing, and I was calling the police. She laughed and said the police would side with the HOA because she had documentation of my violations. Then she turned and walked back to the curb, telling the camera guy to keep filming. I called 911 and reported a trespassing incident with multiple individuals attempting to gain access to my property under false pretenses. The police arrived about 15 minutes later. 2 officers got out of the patrol car and asked what was going on. I explained that Sharon was the HOA gate administrator, and she had shown up with backup trying to bait me into a reaction on camera. I showed them the video I had just recorded, and I explained the pattern of harassment and bogus tow threats. Sharon stepped forward and told the officers she was conducting a compliance inspection authorized by the HOA board. One of the officers, a younger guy with a buzz cut, asked her for documentation. Sharon pulled out the laminated Parking Enforcement Authority card again and handed it to him. The officer looked at the card, then handed it back. "This is not law enforcement," he said. "The HOA is not law enforcement. If you have a dispute with a resident, you need to go through the proper channels. Sharon's face went red. She told the officer that the HOA had the authority to enforce community rules, and she was acting within her rights. The officer said she could enforce rules on common property, but she could not trespass on private property or conduct inspections without the homeowner's consent. He told her if she came back without permission, she could be arrested for trespassing. Sharon stared at the officer, then turned and looked at me. "You are going to regret this," she said. Then she walked back to her car, and the two guys followed her. The officer asked me if I wanted to file a formal complaint, and I said yes. He took my statement, gave me a case number, and told me to call if Sharon came back. He also suggested I contact the HOA board directly and request a meeting to address the harassment. If the board does not respond, you can file a complaint with the state regulatory board, he said. After the police left, I called Rick and told him what happened. He said the police report was good evidence, and the officer's statement about Sharon's lack of authority would carry weight in any hearing or lawsuit. He told me to send a copy of the police report to the management company and to formally request a special meeting of the board to address Sharon's conduct. Florida law allows homeowners to petition for a special meeting if they can get enough signatures, he said. Start circulating a petition. I printed out a petition that night and started going door to door again. Most of the neighbors I had talked to before were willing to sign, and a few others I had not met yet signed after hearing the stories. By the end of the week, I had 43 signatures, more than enough to trigger a special meeting under the HOA bylaws. I submitted the petition to the management company via certified mail and email, copying the entire board. Denise called me 2 days later and said the board had scheduled a special meeting for the following Thursday at 7 p.m. in the clubhouse. She said the meeting would address parking enforcement procedures and community safety protocols. I asked if Sharon would be present, and Denise said all board members and relevant staff would attend. I told her I would be there, and I would be bringing evidence. Rick agreed to come to the meeting as my advisor. He told me to prepare a short presentation summarizing the harassment, the bogus citations, the tow threats, and the police report. Keep it factual and calm, he said. Do not attack Sharon personally. Focus on the procedural violations and the lack of proper authorization. If the board defends her, ask them to produce the meeting minutes showing when they voted to give her enforcement authority. If they cannot, you have them. The night of the meeting, I showed up early with a folder full of documents, the citations, the neighbor testimonies, the police report, the timeline, and the tow vendor's statement about authorization problems. Rick met me in the parking lot, and we walked into the clubhouse together. The room was packed. At least 30 neighbors were there, most of them people I had talked to during the petition drive. Sharon was sitting at the front table with 4 board members, and Denise, the property manager. She was wearing her purple blazer and had her clipboard in front of her. The board president, an older man named Tom, called the meeting to order and read the agenda. He said the meeting had been called to address concerns about parking enforcement and to review community safety protocols. He asked me to present my concerns first. I stood up and walked to the front of the room, then laid out the timeline. I started with Sharon's guest pass scam, the tow threats, the bogus citations, the home visit with backup, and the police report. I showed photos of the citations, played clips of Sharon threatening neighbors, and read excerpts from the police officer's statement. When I finished, Tom asked Sharon to respond. She stood up and said everything I had presented was either taken out of context or a deliberate misrepresentation of her duties. She said the HOA had given her enforcement authority at the annual meeting, and she was simply doing her job. I interrupted and asked her to produce the meeting minutes documenting the vote. Sharon turned and looked at Denise, who shuffled some papers and said the minutes were being finalized and would be available soon. I asked how long ago the annual meeting was, and Tom said it was 11 months ago. I asked why the minutes were not finalized yet, and Denise said there had been some administrative delays. One of the board members, a woman named Carol, spoke up. She said she did not remember voting to give Sharon enforcement authority. Another board member, a man named Jeff, said he remembered discussing a compliance initiative, but not a specific vote. Tom looked uncomfortable. He said the board had delegated certain administrative tasks to Sharon, but he would need to review the records to confirm the scope of her authority. I asked if Sharon had been issuing tow orders without board approval, and Tom said he was not aware of any tow orders. Sharon stood up again and said she had full authority to issue tow orders under the parking rules, and she did not need board approval for individual enforcement actions. I asked her to show me where in the rules it said that. She opened her clipboard and pulled out a printed copy of the parking rules, then flipped through it while the room waited. After a long pause, she said the authority was implied under the compliance officer provisions. I asked if she was the compliance officer, and she said she was acting as interim compliance director. I asked when she was appointed, and she said it was a temporary assignment pending board approval. Carol spoke up again. She said she had not approved any interim appointment, and she wanted to see documentation of Sharon's authority before the meeting continued. Tom said he would ask Denise to pull the relevant files. Denise stood up and left the room, returning a few minutes later with a thin folder. She handed it to Tom, who opened it and read silently for a moment. Then he looked up and said the folder contained a memo from Sharon requesting enforcement authority, but there was no board resolution or meeting minutes approving the request. The room went silent. Sharon's face turned red, and she said the memo was sufficient because the board had not objected. Tom said that was not how board authority worked. Unless the board voted to approve a policy or appointment, it was not valid. He asked Sharon if she had any other documentation, and she said she did not need documentation because she had been doing the job for months and no one had stopped her. Jeff said that was not a legal defense, and Carol said the HOA could be liable for any actions Sharon had taken without proper authority. I let the meeting move on, because my move was not a speech, it was a document. I waited until Sharon started defending herself again, insisting that the parking violations were legitimate and that she had only been trying to protect the community. She said residents were abusing guest parking, ignoring decals, and creating safety hazards. She repeated the line I had been waiting for, "Your camera does not matter. My minutes are the truth." That was when I pulled out my phone and queued up the timestamp clip I had been holding onto. I played the clip for the room. It showed Sharon placing a citation on my windshield, then walking back to her car and checking her phone. The timestamp on the citation said 11:17 a.m. The timestamp on my video, taken from my doorbell camera, showed Sharon placing the citation at 11:32 a.m. 15 minutes later than she had claimed. I paused the video and pointed out that Sharon had backdated the citation to make it look like my friend had been parked longer than he actually was. Then I played the second clip, showing Sharon moving the warning sticker from my friend's car to my mailbox after he had already left. The room erupted. Neighbors started talking over each other, asking how many other citations had been backdated. Carol demanded an explanation from Sharon. Sharon stood up and said the timestamps were estimates and that minor discrepancies were normal. I said 15 minutes was not a minor discrepancy, and backdating enforcement documents was fraud. Tom said the board would need to investigate all of Sharon's citations, and that enforcement actions would be suspended pending the investigation. Sharon said she refused to be treated like a criminal, and that the board was undermining her authority. Carol said Sharon did not have any authority, and that her actions had exposed the HOA to legal liability. Jeff said the board needed to vote immediately to remove Sharon from any enforcement role. Tom called for a vote, and it passed 4-0, with one board member abstaining. Sharon grabbed her clipboard and stood up. "I am calling management, and I am going to be dramatic about it," she said, pulling out her phone. But no one was listening anymore. Neighbors were standing up and sharing their own stories about backdated citations, bogus fees, and harassment. One neighbor said Sharon had threatened to tow his car while he was unloading groceries, and another said Sharon had demanded a $75 guest pass fee for a delivery driver who was on the property for 10 minutes. Rick stood up and addressed the board. He said the HOA needed to immediately notify the tow vendor that Sharon no longer had authorization to issue tow orders, and that any tows conducted under her authority in the past 6 months should be reviewed for refunds. He also said the board should consider retaining independent legal counsel to review the HOA's liability exposure, because Sharon's actions could result in lawsuits from affected homeowners. Tom said the board would take Rick's recommendations under advisement, and that a follow-up meeting would be scheduled within 2 weeks. Sharon walked out of the meeting without another word. As she passed my seat, she glared at me and said, "This is not over." But I could see in her face that it was. Over the next 2 weeks, the fallout was fast and brutal. The management company launched an internal audit of Sharon's enforcement records and found that she had issued over 200 citations in the past year, most of them for violations that either did not exist or were based on rules she had misinterpreted. The tow vendor sent a letter to the HOA terminating their contract, citing repeated violations of proper authorization procedures and reputational damage. Several neighbors filed small claims, complaints demanding refunds for guest pass fees and bogus fines, and the HOA settled most of them to avoid further publicity. The board called a special election to fill the vacant board seats because 2 members resigned rather than face a recall vote. At the next meeting, the board voted to require actual evidence before fines could be issued and to implement a new appeals process for parking violations. They also voted to hire an independent compliance company to handle enforcement, removing all enforcement authority from gate staff and volunteers. Sharon did not attend the meeting. I heard from Linda that Sharon had resigned from the HOA entirely and put her house up for sale. The twist that sealed everything came when the tow yard clerk called me personally. He said he had been reviewing the tow orders Sharon had submitted over the past year, and he found a pattern of duplicate authorizations and forged signatures. He said Sharon had been submitting orders for the same vehicles multiple times, collecting fees from the HOA each time, then canceling the tows before they were executed. He sent me copies of the records, and I forwarded them to Rick and the board. The board referred the matter to local law enforcement, and Sharon was charged with fraud and filing false documents. The final showdown happened 3 months later, in the clubhouse parking lot with my car half lifted and the tow truck idling. I had parked there for the recall election meeting, and Sharon, who had not yet moved out, showed up one last time with a tow truck driver and tried to have my car impounded for unauthorized parking. The driver recognized me and refused to proceed without written authorization from the new board. Sharon screamed at him that she still had authority, and he told her he had already been notified by his company that her name was on a no-contact list. I walked over and told the driver I appreciated his professionalism. He said his company had implemented new policies after the audit, and they would not touch any vehicle in this HOA without signed authorization from the board president or the management company. Sharon turned to me and said I had ruined her life. I told her she had done that herself by abusing her authority and targeting residents who could not fight back. She got into her car and drove off, and I never saw her again. The recall election replaced 3 board members, and the new board president was Carol, who had been the first to question Sharon's authority during the meeting. At the first meeting under the new board, Carol apologized on behalf of the HOA for the harassment and announced that all outstanding fines related to Sharon's enforcement actions would be refunded. She also announced that the HOA had recovered over $18,000 in fraudulent fees from Sharon through a settlement agreement, and that the money would be used to fund new signage, updated parking rules, and a community safety audit. I kept the tow authorization slip in a clear plastic sleeve on my kitchen counter for months after everything ended, just as a reminder of how close things had come. My parents stayed with me through the whole ordeal, and even though the stress was hard, they said they were proud of how I handled it. My friend who had dropped off the groceries that first day came by later and asked if it was safe to park in my driveway again. I told him it was, and that he did not need a guest pass anymore because the new board had eliminated the guest registration requirement entirely. Rick sent me a final bill for his time, and I paid it gladly. He said it was one of the cleanest HOA wins he had seen in years, because the evidence was so clear and the timeline was so tight. He also said I should be ready for other neighbors to ask for help with their own HOA disputes, because word gets around fast. I told him I was happy to share what I learned, but I was done fighting HOAs for a while. The tow vendor that had refused to act without proper authorization sent me a thank you card a few months later. The note said my complaint had helped them clean up their authorization procedures across multiple communities, and that they had terminated contracts with 2 other HOAs where similar abuse was happening. I did not expect that, but it felt good to know the fight had made a difference beyond just my own situation. A year later, Autumn Ridge is a completely different place. The new board is transparent, responsive, and focused on actual community needs instead of petty enforcement. The parking rules are clear and fair, and there have been no tow threats or bogus citations since Sharon left. The neighborhood group chat, which used to be full of complaints about Sharon's harassment, is now just people sharing recipes and organizing block parties. I still see the wheel lift arm inches from my tire in my head sometimes. And I still feel that spike of anger when I think about Sharon shoving that rate sheet in my face. But mostly I feel relieved that it is over, and proud that I did not back down. The time-stamped clip showing Karen moving the notice to frame me was the key to everything, and holding it back until Sharon repeated her claim one last time, on record, was the smartest decision I made. Her bluff got read out loud, and the room reacted exactly the way I hoped. Karen insists on a deadline, and the timestamp proves she lied, and once that happened, there was no coming back for her. The HOA votes to require actual evidence before fines, and a tow vendor refusing to act without proper authorization became the new standard across the community. I hope this story kept you entertained.